Again, it's Ryan, and today I've got a SICK VIC. So you'll turn it on here, and you'll see that's all we get for video. The power light is on, so that's something. So we need to take this thing apart and see if we can figure out this video issue. Alright, now my setup down here is generally not very good for capturing images off the monitor. Just the lighting and everything is just kind of a terrible setup for this. But this is what I'm seeing on the monitor. Now, the black horizontal bars, the naked eye can't see. That's an artifact of the camera picking it up off the monitor. But the white diagonal stripes, that's what I'm seeing. And what that suggests to me is it's probably a dead VIC chip, because there's just no coherent video coming out of here at all. So that's the most likely culprit, I think. Okay, now before I start taking this thing apart, a couple things here that we can notice right off the bat. For one, pretty obviously, we're missing the 1 key. Some of the lettering could really use a retro bright and a cleaning, as really could the rest of the case. It's all pretty dirty. And here on the back, you'll see that one of the snap latches is broken off. Now, I actually do have that piece. It was rattling around inside the case, so at some point I'll try to get that reattached. So let's go ahead and get this thing apart. Flip it over and try not to lose the screws. And it'll open up real easy. Take off the keyboard connector over here and the LED connector, which you see on these is kind of leaned over a bit instead of sticking straight up and down. Okay, so it's a little bit dirty in here, but not too bad. I don't see anything obviously wrong. There aren't any bulging capacitors or anything like that. The fuse is obviously good, because if it wasn't good, the LED light wouldn't have been on, so we can rule that out right away. Now, I suspect that the VIC chip is probably bad, and it's here in this metal RF cage. So we just need to pop off this lid, and I'm going to do that with this chip lifter that I have. And you can see that I'm kind of using my fingers as a fulcrum here so that I don't damage any of the components on the board as I try to pry this up. There we go. And there's the famous VIC chip. Okay, so we tried reseating the chips. That didn't work. Now, here's the thing about the VIC-20. At this point in a repair, I would probably try to start going through a typical diagnostic routine to try to narrow down the problem, figure out where it could possibly be. Thing is, on the VIC, since all of the major chips, all of the MOS Technologies chips, and not coincidentally, the chips that most often fail are socketed. So most often in these, what's going to fail is either the 6502, the CPU, the VIC chip, the 6560, or if you've got a PAL unit, the 6561, or the two 6522s. Occasionally the RAM fails, but, you know, RAM is cheap. That's easy. The 6560 or the 6562 or the 6561 or the 2 6522s. Occasionally the RAM fails, but RAM is cheap. That's easy. 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 RAM But because all of these chips are socketed, if you've got a spare, it's actually faster to just swap the chip than it is to go through a long, complicated diagnostic process. If you swap the chip and it doesn't fix the problem, then you go through the diagnostic and you try to figure out, okay, is it one of the RAM chips? Is it one of the other supporting chips? But I have a spare of most of these chips, the major chips. And since we've got what appears to be a video problem, where we're not outputting any video, I'm just going to swap out the VIC chip and see what happens. I'll be real careful getting in there. Generally, I prefer to use a tool like this, where I can lift the chip straight up and out, basically, as opposed to something like this, where I've got to pry it from one end. But in here, because of this RF cage, there's just no room to get this in on this side. Okay, so there's our VIC chip out. Here's my spare. This actually has a heatsink on it already. So let's put this in here. Okay. Now I'm just going to go handheld here, because if this works, this will be real quick. And if it doesn't, it'll be real quick. All right, and turning on. And there we go. Not sure how well you can see that in the lights, but there we go. Good screen.
Okay, so we've got a good screen, but the colors are clearly way off. I mean, that border is definitely it's a light green, and it ought to be more of a teal color. But there is a way to adjust that. If we look here near the VIC chip, we have two little potentiometers. We have this one here that's got a red tip on it, and then this one here that's kind of white. And the red one adjusts the hue. Both of them adjust the video output signal. So if we adjust the hue a little bit here, we can take that green all the way into something that is a bit more of a teal color, which is what we actually want to have. Okay, that actually looks pretty good. Now, if we come back over here and take a look at the white one, this one actually adjusts the brightness and the contrast level. So I don't know that adjusting this is really going to do much for us. And it doesn't really look like it. Alright, I think that's a pretty good image. I hadn't planned to show the keyboard part of this fix because I don't have a replacement key yet, but I thought I'd show the disassembly process. You can see here that I've already removed most of the little screws that hold the back on. There are really just a few screws left that are under this tape here. It's just like packing tape, so we can just go ahead and pull that off. If you want to, you can replace it later, but it's not really necessary. It doesn't really do anything except protect the wires a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and remove the shift lock key next. It's pretty easy. Just have to desolder these two leads from the body of the shift lock mechanism itself. You can see here there's just a couple of blobs of solder holding these leads in there. They just stick through some holes in those pins, so we just need to remove that solder. I'm going to use some solder wick here to do that. once the solder is removed, the pins just pull straight out. And just push on the mechanism and the key will pop right out. You do want to be careful though not to break these tabs on the side of the mechanism, because that's what holds it into the keyboard body. Now I'll just remove the last few screws. And then lift off the back plate. So here's the circuit board, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. Alright, so let's try to get a closer look at the key stems, or the plungers here. You can see how they're all kind of oriented in there. Now I'm going to pop out the busted one, which is right here. And those just sit in there. They're not clipped or anything. Okay, so here it is. Okay, now let's look at the bottom. These little rubber bits right here are what make the electrical contact on the circuit board. And if I hold it up next to the board, you can see how those contacts sit over the contacts on the board. And when the key is pressed down, they make the contact, they complete the circuit, and then the computer can recognize that a key's been pressed. So it's a pretty simple construction. There's not really much to a VIC's keyboard.
Alright, well, since this has been a really quick repair video, let's take a little tour around the VIC. I have here two VICs representing the two most common models, at least in the States. There were actually several different motherboard variants. If you're interested in those, I highly recommend a new book by Giacomo M. Vernoni, I believe is how it's pronounced. I'm sorry if I'm messing up your name. I really am. But the book is called Commodore VIC-20, A Visual History. I'll put a link in the description below. It's a fantastic book. It's beautiful. It's got, among a lot of other pictures, it's got images of many of the motherboard variations. Also has a lot of the games that were available for the VIC. All right, so let's take a closer look. Now, right away, you can see two major differences. The older board has a lot more chips, and it has this huge heatsink. The cost-reduced board has a lot fewer chips, a much simpler board. Now, the heatsink here was needed because Commodore originally put some of the power circuitry on the main board. You can see the voltage regulator here. I can't really move this out of the way far enough for you to see it, but for you to get it completely out of the way, but you can see it there through the vents. This circuitry produced a lot of heat, and so they needed this huge heatsink. Some of the other variants, the heatsink was actually attached to this shield over the cartridge port, and it would get so hot that people would actually burn themselves on their fingers as they tried to insert a cartridge, which is why it got separated in this version. Now, they produced a few different variants on this design. In some of the earlier variants, the chips, instead of being lined up kind of going this way, were lined up this way. It's really, it's interesting to see how many versions of this that they went through before they finally got smart and decided that, hey, maybe having all this power circuitry on the main board wasn't a very smart idea. And they put that in the power brick instead. Now here, this is the power brick for this old model of VIC-20. Here's the power brick for the later model. Looks much more like what you'd see from a 64. Okay. So if you have an early model VIC, you'll notice that they have this two-prong power connector. The cost-reduced versions have the circular DIN type connector, like you'll see on the later 64s. So if you've got the one with the two-prong connector, your power supply is actually going to be pretty reliable. If you have one with the round DIN connector, well, those can fail just like the ones for the 64 could fail and cause serious damage to the chips on your board.
The other major difference is the number of chips. Now, both have the same primary chips. Both have a 6502 processor. Both have two 6522 CIAs. Both have the same ROMs, the character ROM, the basic ROM, and the kernel ROM. And both have the chip that gives the VIC its name, the video interface chip. Now, in countries that used the NTSC video standard, which would be most countries in the Americas and several East Asian nations like Japan and South Korea, this was the MOS 6560. In countries that used the PAL video standard, namely most of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and a few countries in South America, this was the MOS 6561. Now, the main difference on the board is the number of RAM chips. The older model has 10 2114 static RAM chips at 512 bytes each. The newer model uses two 2 kilobyte chips and 3 of the 2114s. Why? It was cheaper, and that arrangement allowed them to retain the same memory map.
Now, the other kind of odd thing about both of these boards is this long jumper cable here, jumper wire. And it looks like a complete last-minute hack job. And, you know, who knows, maybe it was. But it does serve a valuable purpose. See, on the original VIC, the power coming in was 9 volts. That was turned into 5 volts by the regulator here. All the chips use 5 volts. Okay. This wire takes 9 volts over to the user port. On the newer versions, remember they couldn't change that because they wanted to maintain, it had to be, you know, functionally identical to the earlier versions. So in the newer versions, we have 5 and 9 volts coming onto the board from the power supply. And the 5 volts goes to the chips, and the 9 volts from here is brought over to the user port. Now, I'm not really sure what Commodore was thinking when they did this, why they thought that they needed 9 volts over here. I can only think of one thing that ever plugged into the user port that I know for a fact needed 9 volts, and that was the RS-232 adapter. But it's possible that some printer adapters that plugged in might have needed 9 volts. A lot of times, you know, back in the day, the electronics, you know, almost always used 5 volts. There are exceptions. The SID chip needed 12 for certain things. But if you think about like the disk drives, for instance, they used 5 volts for the electronics and 12 for the motors. So maybe Commodore was thinking, okay, let's supply extra power over here so that other companies, you know, coming up with other products, you know, will give them a little extra power to play with, so that maybe they can come up with new things for the computer to be able to do. I really don't know. But the presence of this wire suggests that it was if not a last-minute addition, that it was certainly added late in the design process, because the 64 has exactly the same layout on the user port, which is why you can use the same peripherals on a VIC and a 64. You can plug a VIC modem into this and it'll work just the same as if you plug it in on a 64. They maintained the compatibility of this port, and they did it without a big ugly jumper wire. So yeah, I would love to know exactly how this came about and what Commodore really thought they were going to use that for. Okay, well that's all I've got for you today. I don't have a replacement 1 key yet to finish putting the keyboard back together, or I'd show you that. So yeah, it's just the opposite of taking it apart, which I already showed you, so it's not very exciting. All right. So I hope this was useful and informative, and let me know what you think in the comments below.